Thank you.
Sorry. You want to repeat that, Bill?
No, that's fine. I'm sure everybody has that memorized. Next, please, Allie. Just a little commercial moment. The American Planning Association's Water and Planning Network is basically a quasi-division at the American Planning Association, but it is free, unlike most divisions, and that's why we characterize it as a network. You don't need to be an APA or AWRA member or anyone else. We have about 500 members that we've accumulated over the last, I'd say, 4 years or so. The Water and Planning Network is an outgrowth of a water planning initiative at APA that started about 7 years ago in response to the Western droughts and has expanded to address water issues throughout the country. There was an excellent conference in 2018 called Water and Planning Connect, and we've just built since then. We have monthly newsletters, we have webinars, and to join, you can email us at waterandplanning.org. And you can also follow, although I will admit that our social media presence is not strong at present, but we're working to build that. Today I'd like to introduce Allison Sant as our main speaker and author. Allison is a partner and co-founder of the Studio for Urban Projects, which is an interdisciplinary design collaborative based in San Francisco that works at the intersection of architecture, urbanism, art, and social activism. For more than 15 years, the studio is focused on public programming, urban prototyping, and civic dialogue, aiming to bring social justice and sustainability to the design of cities. Allie's the author of From the Ground Up, as I said, Local Efforts to Create Resilient Cities. The book and this webinar examine how American cities are mitigating and adapting to climate change while creating greater equity and livability. She has taught at the College of Environmental Design, UC Berkeley, and California College of Arts, Mills College, and San Francisco Art Institute. Joining her today are 3 co-speakers, and they're actually representative of some of the case studies from the book. Jessica Dandridge, Executive Director of the Water Collaborative in New Orleans. We have Owen Franklin, the Pennsylvania State Director of the Trust for Public Land, and Peter Milinowski, the Executive Director of the Billion Oyster Project in New York City. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Allie. And if you have questions, please jot them down in the chat or in the Q&A, either place. I'll monitor both. And we'll try to save 5 or 10 minutes at the end to address your questions. So take it away, Allie.
Thank you so much. Well, hello to all of you, and thank you to APA's Water and Planning Network for inviting this conversation today, and Bill and Manny and Marianne and Rachel, who are all behind the scenes putting this together. So we really appreciate it. I'd also like to thank our panelists, Jessica Dandridge, Owen Franklin, and Peter Milinowski, who I will introduce shortly. So I'll start with an overview of the book, and then I'll go into some of the case studies it describes to give some context to our conversation. Today, this panel will explore the ways in which cities are adapting to the threats of future floods by greening streets, designing adaptive neighborhoods, creating absorbent schoolyards, and restoring habitat. As our climate changes, our relationship to water is increasingly defining the design of cities. Cloudbursts overwhelm watersheds, flooding low-lying areas, while storm surges inundate coastlines. These events have challenged us to find solutions. As journalist Tracy Metz described in her book, Sweet and Salt, after the car, it is water that is now changing the face of the city. We know that climate change is an urgent problem. We have less than 8 years to have carbon emissions and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius just to avoid the worst of its effects. But many of us have experienced them already, from wildfires and extreme heat to severe storms and flooding. Just last year, Hurricane Ida battered Louisiana and then dropped more than 6 inches of rain in just a few hours in cities, including New York and Philadelphia, causing extreme flooding. We also know that climate change exaggerates existing systemic inequities as communities are disproportionately exposed to its effects. Cities are the place to act. Together, the world's cities are responsible for 75% of global carbon emissions. They're also the places where the majority of us live as the world's population has tipped to urban. How we live in cities matters. For example, transportation is responsible for 29% of US greenhouse gas emissions, with the majority of that number attributed to passenger cars. When we reclaim our streets from cars to create safe places to walk and bike and more efficient public transit for everyone, we lower carbon emissions while creating greater equity. When we tear up the concrete to create green streets, rain gardens, and floodable parks to slow stormwater, we're preventing extreme floods while making the places we live more lush and alive. And we can do this work by providing jobs and greater economic security to communities that have been historically under-resourced. When we plant cities with street trees and expand our urban tree canopy, we're absorbing stormwater, sequestering carbon, reducing air pollution, and cooling our streets. And when we adapt our shorelines by restoring wetlands or installing oyster reefs and other nature-based solutions, we're buffering future storms in frontline communities while supporting coastal habitats. As From the Ground Up describes, this work is already underway in cities across the country. When I began writing this book, I understood the ways in which our historical ecology affects how cities and neighborhoods fare in extreme weather. Predictably, in severe storms, it floods in areas that were once wetlands or marshes and stream beds. What became more vivid to me as I researched the book was how people are impacted in extreme weather is equally shaped by the history of systemic racism in this country. Due to discriminatory policies like redlining and restrictive covenants, race is too often correlated with where people live in cities, what elevation they live at, what temperatures they're exposed to, and what resources they have in times of emergency. As a result, climate change disproportionately affects under-resourced communities and communities of color. For example, New Orleans is a city defined through its relationship to water, wound around the curves of the Mississippi River, flanked by Lake Pontchartrain to the north and Lake Bourne to the east. It is built through bayous and wetland marshes and penetrated by shipping canals. Water is everywhere. As the city grew, discriminatory development policies have condensed its Black population in lower elevations, such as the 7th, 8th, and upper 9th wards. This had devastating effects during Hurricane Katrina, when New Orleans' Black population made up 76% of its flood victims. New Orleans has become one of the wettest cities in the United States, with an average rainfall of 62 inches a year. Even with the hurricane and storm damage risk reduction system, the city is at greater risk from flooding, from rainfall, than by overtopping of levees. We often think that complicated problems like global climate change need to be solved by powerful governments and their plans, policies, and regulations, and they do. The Clean Water Act is a great example of a policy that regulates pollution and has supported green infrastructure in cities across the country. It's been a critical tool in cleaning our urban waters, restoring watersheds in cities, and providing fish and wildlife habitat. But for those policies to succeed, the opposite is also true. The most effective solutions are born out of the communities they serve. We need both. Communities must lead the solutions ahead and be supported by government policies and funding in doing so. In New Orleans post-Hurricane Katrina, Angela Chalk, Executive Director of Healthy Community Services in the 7th Ward, worked with Waterways Gulf South to help direct investments to her neighborhood. With volunteers, she created a green infrastructure demonstration in her own yard. And when the next storm hit and she didn't flood, her neighbors were interested in the same remedies. Knowing her neighbors and her neighborhood, she brought people together to learn about how green infrastructure works and how it complements the complex network of levees, pumps, and canals throughout the city. Now the neighborhood has entire blocks of demonstration gardens. And the 7th Ward is also part of the Waterways Champions, a training program which is making the people in the neighborhood hit the hardest by flooding, the experts in green infrastructure solutions. As Angela said in our interview, now people can tell you about native plants. They can tell you the capacity of a cypress tree to hold water or clean the air. Everybody's a green infrastructure specialist now. In the wake of Katrina, with a $141 million HUD grant was awarded to New Orleans to create the Gentilly Resilience District, they toured the 7th Ward. The new Resilience District is constructing a network of green infrastructure solutions intended to manage stormwater, slow land subsidence, and create vibrant public spaces. It was championed by local architecture firm Wagoner and Ball, which proposed a vision for living with water in the Greater New Orleans Water Plan. Today, community-led approaches are being expanded upon as a network of permeable parks, green streets, and stormwater corridors are being built. But water can often be hidden in New Orleans by tall walls along its canals or obscured below streets as water courses through pumps. As Jessica pointed out in our interview, despite being so impactful in our lives, it's not something that people understand. Just like in Louisiana, it's mandated that we have to learn about the state's history. It should be mandated that we have to learn about our own ecology. St. Anthony Green Streets, one of the Gentilly Resilience District projects, is testing how to build local knowledge by investing in a community process in which residents are contributing to the project's design. Walking and biking tours explore the neighborhood's history, including its history of flooding. Community members participated in workshops to design roadside rain gardens with spray chalk and mocked up bioswales in neighborhood parks using potted plants. Workshops facilitated collaboratively made design drawings using stencils and collage techniques. When communities are involved in generating solutions, they can make investments in their neighborhoods, from street trees to large-scale parks relevant to their immediate and long-term needs. As Erin Chang, the community engagement lead for St. Anthony Green Streets, described, if we invest in our capacity to wrestle with the hard questions we face as a community, then we can create a set of guidelines that tell us what we should be investing in. Although this work is ongoing, the process of creating water literacy through training programs, public education, and community dialogue can shape the future of New Orleans and create the opportunity for communities to help develop solutions to flooding, weigh the consequences of climate change, and direct the future of their city. Public education is critical to the success of many of the projects I focus on in the book. In New York, public school students involved in the Billy and Oyster project are restoring the harbor and buffering future storms by growing oysters and monitoring reefs while gaining job skills and environmental literacy. At the Billy and Oyster project headquarters on Governor's Island, students at the harbor school learn to build and operate boats, spawn and harvest oysters, design and create reef systems, and monitor restoration sites by diving into the city's waters. Governor's Island also houses the BOP laboratory and is a site for shell recycling. 8,000 pounds of shell per week are collected from approximately 70 restaurants and cured in a giant mound to be used as substrate for constructed reef systems. The public is engaged by volunteering to help assemble reef structures and maintain and monitor the Community Reefs program. Even in the most polluted waters of the harbor, participants find bryozoans, polychaete worms, anemones, different species of tunicates, and blue crabs on the oyster cages. To give some historical context, eastern oysters once thrived in the intertidal and subtidal areas along the shorelines of the New York, New Jersey harbor estuary. In 1609, when Henry Hudson entered the estuary, he had to navigate his ship around 220,000 acres of oyster reefs. It was once thought to be one of the most biologically productive, diverse, and dynamic environments on the planet, with the native oyster central to this thriving ecosystem. As Peter said when I interviewed him, when Europeans first arrived, they talked about there being so many seabirds that you couldn't see the sky, and so many fish you couldn't see the surface of the water. The population of New Orleans exploded in the 19th century, and by 1890, more than 2.5 million people lived there. This growth had significant environmental effects on the landscape of the city and beyond, as the intensive use of natural resources and disposal of waste began to overwhelm the ecosystem. The once thriving commercial oyster beds throughout the estuary were gradually closed. And by 1927, as a result of increasing water pollution, development, and overharvesting, the last of them was shut down, marking the end of oystering in New York City. Oysters became functionally extinct. Today, projects to revive the oyster population are focused on restoring habitat and buffering future storms. Although oysters may not be used for eating again, restoring their function in the estuary may help to manage the effects of climate change. These experiments started by piloting locations for oyster reefs in places like Soundview Park in the Bronx. After a small 1-acre pilot showed natural recruitment, it was identified as one of several throughout the estuary, becoming one of the Billy and Oyster Project's first pilots. Through the project, students, scientists, and volunteers have helped to expand the reef and monitor its success. Examples like the Billy and Oyster Project describe how often experiments need to start small and scale successes. Today, Soundview is one of the largest restored oyster habitats in the estuary. The lessons learned there have informed other pilot projects, including near the former Tappan Zee Bridge, where oysters are now thriving. And oysters are also a part of the new living breakwaters for Staten Island being built today. Created by the landscape architecture firm Scape, it combines oyster restoration techniques used throughout the harbor with breakwater structures. Today, the Billy and Oyster Project is currently the nursery for more than 30 oyster restoration projects in the harbor. These efforts illustrate that climate action is an opportunity to revive our urban waters, and bring people into the process of creating resilient solutions. They are also an opportunity to create thriving communities and address the history of racial injustice. Philadelphia provides an important example. By 2009, almost half of Philadelphia's landscape, 44%, had been covered in concrete, with many open spaces developed as public rights-of-way. Nearly 3/4 of its historic waterways were culverted, sewers were placed in creek beds, and river valleys were flattened to make way for subdivisions. As Mark Camerata, Philadelphia's Deputy Water Commissioner, said, we've modified the urban landscape to a point where people don't really know what water resources the regulatory community is trying to protect. The Philadelphia Water Department proposed to meet its EPA Clean Water Act requirements with nature-based solutions to manage water where it falls. This approach prioritized keeping stormwater out of the traditional gray infrastructure system by enhancing and supporting it with green infrastructure. To accomplish this, Philadelphia set the ambitious goal to green 1/3 of the existing impervious landscape within the city, including in its schoolyards, vacant lots, and parks. Philadelphia has combined its commitment to making green spaces accessible to all its residents with a stormwater management approach that prioritizes green infrastructure. Philadelphia is known as the poorest of the largest US cities, and these investments have brought improvements to public facilities in neighborhoods that have been historically under-resourced. Like many Philadelphians, 1 in 3 Americans does not have a park or a green space within walking distance of their home. Most often, these are the city's lowest income residents. 26% of Philadelphians live below the poverty line, and the city's majority Black population is twice as likely to be considered working poor as their white neighbors. Philadelphia is one of the most segregated cities in the United States. Its racist history has created predominantly Black neighborhoods marked by generations of public disinvestment, including in parks. This disparity has concerned national advocacy groups like the Trust for Public Land, which launched a national campaign to ensure that all urban residents have access to nature. TPL's work in Philadelphia started with 10 pilot projects, which were quickly scaled to 25. They worked with the city's public schools to pilot green schoolyards that would capture water, cool neighborhoods, and create outdoor classrooms where students learn about ecology, wildlife, plants, and hydrology while providing healthy spaces for outdoor play. Philadelphia has more than 1,300 acres of schoolyards citywide. Greening them alone would add over 400 acres towards the city's permeable landscape goal, and opening them to the public after school creates much needed access to open space. These projects led to the restoration of Lanier Park in Grays Ferry in South Philadelphia. Like many parks in Philadelphia, this space was a park in name only. It was closed and gated to the public for more than a decade. Derelict, the site had turned into a place of contention, marked by crime and neglect. Historically, Lanier Park served as a racial dividing line. Grays Ferry had been at the center of conflict between Black and white Philadelphians for generations. But this 4-acre park is within a 10-minute walk of more than 11,000 residents, offering enough space to create a sizable neighborhood park and manage the area's stormwater. Ultimately, seeing the benefits of reopening Lanier, residents came together to plan the park. They met in a series of meetings held at different venues around the neighborhood to discuss how the park could fit the neighborhood's needs. Structured workshops gave opportunities for residents to determine the park's program. After years of abandonment, the park is once again being used by people brought together at the playground, the dog park, baseball field, fitness, and picnic area. The park also manages water for the entire neighborhood. As Daniel Dank from TPL said, folks came together for the first time. They got to see that although there were big differences between them, there were actually many similarities. Everybody wanted safety. They wanted green space. They wanted something open and accessible for all. Ultimately, this process of engaging the community also strengthens its social fabric, important for healing the neighborhood and for its future resiliency. As author Eric Kleinenberg, who researched the 1995 Chicago heat wave, argues, these connections can mean the difference between living and dying in extreme weather. At Lanier, the park and the process that created it helped to create the necessary social infrastructure to weather the storms ahead. Work to repair this neighborhood is still underway, but with a common public space to steward, there is substantial incentive to keep coming back to the table. From the ground up is a call to action. We must invest in the under-resourced communities first, providing not only transit routes, bike lanes, green spaces, and parks, but also affordable housing, jobs, and public education. Together, these actions represent investment in the capacity of people. Informed by a shared base of knowledge about the environmental reality ahead, they may envision and direct the plans that are acted upon by policymakers, urban planners, and practitioners. Government officials, nonprofit organizations, and community-based groups and individual advocates may build alliances to support and embolden this vision together. It's a recipe for how we restore and reinvigorate the democratic process and move forward to creating the resilient cities that will be essential to managing the storms ahead. So thank you. I just want to put in a little plug for the book website before I introduce our panelists, from thegroundupbook.info, where you can find a chapter and all the recordings of events, more information about the book and the team that put it together. And then also Island Press is offering a 30% discount to today's participants in the webinar with the code webinar at islandpress.org. So in writing from the ground up, I interviewed more than 90 people who generously shared their experiences and insights. And I'm very lucky to have 3 of those experts here with me today to talk about their work. I'll have you all turn your cameras on so people can see you. Jessica Dandridge is the Executive Director of the Water Collaborative of Greater New Orleans. She is dedicated to her life to community advocacy and campaign development for organizations seeking to be socially, economically, and culturally inclusive. Today, TWC focuses on water management, hazard mitigation, water justice through access, affordability, and quality, and equitable community transformation through blue-green jobs and the renewable economy. Owen Franklin is President, Pennsylvania State Director for the Trust for Public Land, a nonprofit organization that creates parks and protects land to help strengthen and connect communities. He works with leaders across the Commonwealth to plan, fund, design, and create dynamic spaces that serve the unique priorities of the communities they serve. This work includes a robust portfolio of community schoolyard transformations, a specialty that TPL delivers across the country. Owen previously served with the City of Philadelphia, directing an anti-poverty initiative. Peter Milinowski is the Executive Director of the Billion Oyster Project. He grew up farming oysters with his parents and siblings on the Fisher's Island oyster farm. His passion for the environment and education led him to the New York Harbor School, where he founded the school's aquaculture and oyster restoration programs and spent 5 years as a teacher. He spends as much of his free time as possible on the water or in the woods with his 3 children. So thank you all for joining me. Very happy to have you here.
Thank you, Ali.
Thanks for joining me. So I'd like to start with some questions for each of you individually, and then maybe some questions for all of you. So Jessica, maybe we'll start with you. The concept of living with water was the focus of the Greater New Orleans Urban Water Plan in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. And this idea is informing resiliency efforts across the city. In your work at the Water Collaborative, how do you work to recast water management and climate resilience as an opportunity to live with water, especially in a region that's experienced the trauma of repeated flooding?
Yes, and thank you, Allison, for having me, and APA as well. So I would start with the background of living with water is rooted in Hurricane Katrina, but really even before that. New Orleans in Southeast Louisiana has been struggling with water since it was occupied by the French and the Spanish, and the removal of indigenous folks in the 1500s. Indigenous peoples of Louisiana understood how to live with water because Louisiana is meant to flood. It's a delta, and it's not even a very old delta. It's nearly 5,000 years old, and compared to other deltas around the world. And so there's been a history of trying to figure out how to live with water, but they did that through great infrastructure. And they did that through levees, and the Great Flood of 1927 really spurred that, as well as the invention of the wood screw pump in 1913 by Albert Baldwin Woods, which is how the city has thrived and expanded, but also why it's sinking and why it's susceptible to flooding. And so that has caused generations of collective trauma from, as I mentioned, the movement of indigenous communities through the Trail of Tears, from enslavement, where actually enslaved Africans had to build levee systems for plantations. A lot of people don't know that, but they actually built and maintained those systems. And then again, the flood of 1927, Hurricane Betsy, Hurricane Camille, I can go down the list. And so that has spurred, and with Katrina obviously being the most recent moment, in the 21st century, it has spurred a movement amongst professionals as well as community members to create a new movement away from gray infrastructure, and one that is rooted in liberation and undoing years of environmental injustices. And so the movement of green infrastructure in Southeast Louisiana and in New Orleans is more so rooted in improving quality of life, improving ability for people to live in New Orleans and be successful and thrive. The Living with Water movement is consistently pushed by community members, not only because of its effectiveness that Allison talked about with Angela Chalk and many of the other organizations that exist here in New Orleans that promote it, but it thrives because there's a multitude of benefits that, like I said, reduce historical violence that has been consistently put upon residents that are particularly low income and vulnerable. The Living with Water movement is about collective building. It's about community resilience, and it's about listening and partnership and solidarity more than anything else, right? We have tons of architecture firms and the engineering firms who are local as well as national who participate in the process. But without that community voice, without that solidarity of residents, without that collective work that's being done, it could not exist today. And that's what my organization does, is we bring people together to collectively build in Orleans as well as other parishes around Southeast Louisiana. But it is rooted again in understanding that we are not only rebuilding a community to live with water, but to thrive in. That's why our mission says that we're thriving with it. And because we want to see New Orleans here in another 300 years, but we won't be able to do that by repeating the mistakes and misinformation and disinformation that we had done for the past 100 to 300 years, depending on where you start in your timeline.
Thank you for that. It's remarkable work. So Owen, I want to turn to you. Philadelphia is the poorest big city in the country. Greening schoolyards and parks in the city has been important for managing stormwater, but also a crucial part of creating social resilience as communities come together to envision the future of their public spaces. With Philadelphia's ambitious goals to green a third of the city's impervious landscapes, how can these investments best create both physical and social infrastructure in the communities that need them most?
Oh, thank you, Ali. I mean, every dollar that goes into green infrastructure is a dollar that goes into, of course, water quality and water management, goes into cooling the air, it goes into beautifying our streets and our public places, it goes into creating new space that residents can connect to, can steward, can be together in. Every dollar goes in a lot of different directions at once. So you've got real opportunity for multiple benefits, as many of us know. And what you need to look for then is where are there real opportunities for multiple opportunities, and also where are there existing areas where we have multiple needs? Where can we best concentrate those multiple impacts so that they are in places that radiate those impacts and that address communities where those impacts are most needed? We think about our public spaces as critical places for green infrastructure dollars because these are the spaces that people are already connected to. These are the spaces that people already have some utility for. And by bringing these green stormwater infrastructure dollars to them, we are making investments in them. We're making them perform at a higher level. They're punching at a different weight class. And they also serve as a magnet for additional actors to make impact. When we make that kind of investment in our public spaces for the purposes of climate, for the purposes of community, we garner the attention of other actors who might realize that now this public space is better able to serve their interests in accommodating public health, in supporting community safety, in serving education. We believe very much in the opportunity of schoolyards like the one behind me as a critical place where these dollars can be directed, because schools are historical natural places where people come together. They serve a very critical role in the health of our cities and in the education, obviously, of our students. And by providing these kinds of amenities in places that we already have a need for, we've already paid for them, we're paying for them every day through our taxes, how do we ensure that these public spaces are doing the very best they can every day for everybody? And when I come to a place like a schoolyard, I see so many things happening at once. I see students being educated. I see the air being cleaned. I see the water being managed. And I see neighbors having a chance to come together, find that they have common ground, and then support one another. It's the fact that the water is being managed in that space may not be the first thing that comes to mind for residents, but it is something that impacts the way that they use that space. And just by being in that space again and again, there's a more natural understanding of the environment in which we live and the environments that we need to connect to. And particularly in places where real programming and education can happen, there is that opportunity for very intentional learning that can occur about the role that that space is serving for climate, for water management. So we believe in a place like Philadelphia where there's these green is a scarce resource. And when you have green resources to distribute them in areas where there's a lack of access today, and where the impact of that resource is going to go as far as it can and in as many directions as it can.
Thank you, Owen. Holistic solutions. With the urgency we face, it's really important, and your projects really illustrate that. Pete, I want to turn to you. When I interviewed for the book, you hosted me on a boat ride from Governor's Island to the Gowanus Canal and up the East River. And I have to say, it was my first chance and opportunity to be hit with New York Harbor, spray. And it was quite an experience, even after living in New York for years. You really opened my eyes to the natural abundance of what was once part of New Yorkers' lives in that trip. So I'm wondering that with the recent accomplishments, such as the recovering oyster population of the Tappan Zee Bridge, which unfolded as I was writing the book, what's your vision of what a restored New York Harbor could be, both for its ecological benefits and for the resiliency it can provide in managing the storms of the future?
Yeah, great question. I just want to say thanks, and it's really nice to be on with you all. It's a great group, so I appreciate you all having me on. But our vision for restored harbor is, we see New York Harbor as New York City's biggest and best looking open space that should be enjoyed by all New Yorkers. And the fact we have an opportunity here in New York City to live in a city that's surrounded by a vibrant natural resource. And so I imagine a future New York Harbor, so I'm looking at it right now, but I imagine seeing all the birds and the fish that you can see if you go out to Montauk or go to these other places where people tend to leave New York City to go find nature. And I have the privilege through my work to spend a lot of time on the harbor. And I know that all those animals are still here. They're just fewer and further between. So we think about a restored New York Harbor. We think about everyone in New York City being able to walk down to the water's edge, reliably see ospreys and egrets and seals and dolphins and all these cool animals that used to live here and still do, just in greatly reduced numbers. So we want to see a harbor that's not only enhanced biologically, but also enjoyed by all the people who live around it. So we work through the oyster restoration to create different ways to access the harbor, different ways to participate, for communities to participate in restoring nature where they live.
It's a nice vision, especially in our biggest city in the country. So I want to move to a little bit to water quality. Both Jessica and Pete have talked about it in their work. But for over 50 years, the Clean Water Act has had the goal of making America's urban waters swimmable and fishable, and has done much to do with the green infrastructure that we see in cities today. However, the Delaware River is still the 5th most polluted river in the country, and runoff from the Mississippi River creates a seasonal dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, and 20 billion gallons of untreated raw sewage and runoff bypass New York City's sewage treatment plants and get dumped at the New York Harbor estuary. So how should we be addressing pollution in our watersheds? And what's the right balance of managing it at its source, using nature-based approaches to absorb water where it falls, or natural processes to mitigate contaminants once they've made it into our waterways? It's for all of you too.
Who wants to go? Should I go? I actually have a pretty good story I just heard about water quality in New York Harbor. So a friend of mine works for the Port Authority, and she's worked there for a very long time. And New York Harbor used to be known as a clean port. So commercial operators could bring their boats into New York City and count on the water quality being so bad that all the animals on the boat would die. And so they would clean their boats by coming into New York. And then after the passage of the Clean Water Act by the 90s, so the late 90s, that stopped being the case. And so the Port Authority would actually get complaints from vessel operators because they would come in and the animals on their boats would still be alive. So they'd have to find a new way to clean them. But it just goes to show you, you mentioned the Clean Water Act earlier and the profound impact that has had on the water quality in New York Harbor, where while it is still polluted, it's technically safe to swim in most days of the year. So if it was a beach, it would be open when, except after a rain event. So I was just say that one thing is that it's a lot cleaner than everyone thinks. And then the second thing, the way that you solve the water quality problems in New York Harbor is we just have to stop pouring sewage into the harbor, which is sort of wild when you think about that. In the greatest city in the world, sorry, New Orleans, we're prevented access to our greatest natural resource because contaminated with human waste, which is not a challenge you typically, associate with developing countries. But here in New York, that's why we can't access the harbor. And all it takes is public will. So if enough people in New York City are upset by that fact, enough people in New York City want to have safe access to the harbor all the time, and we have the technology to change that. It just takes the public will.
I mean, I think that it's all the above as far as where and how you're managing it, and I think that the ability for the public to understand the connectivity of the solution is I think where we have the greatest ground to gain. I don't know that the idea of living in a watershed is one that comes to mind very often. I think we think about our neighborhood. I think we think about our voting precinct. We think about our school district. We don't think about our watershed, and yet that is impacting our lives and will continue to impact our lives in ways that are more profound than a lot of the other things I just listed. But I think that as we look to reduce the combined sewer overflows that Peter just mentioned, as we think about all the solutions that can go into that, and we think creatively about using every kind of untapped nook and cranny of our urban environments to perform at their greatest capacity, I think that's how we start to see the real magic of watershed transformation in urban spaces that really can look very different than they look today. They're starting to go in that direction, but I think we've got a far distance to go in realizing the potential for really transforming our cities into these breathing, porous, resemblant of what they once were communities that are better able to manage what the sky dumps on them.
Well, first I'd like to argue with Peter that the greatest city in the world is New Orleans. And I have lots of evidence to prove it. But what I will say is that New Orleans has a very complex relationship with water quality. Obviously, living with water is one of them. But water is a complicated story in Louisiana. People have been living with water since people have moved here, right? Since the indigenous tribes, they've learned how to live with water. And then you go to working class immigrants. They, lived in the swamps of Louisiana, collecting pellets and fur traps and so on. And our greatest dishes are rooted in our relationship to water. Louisiana wouldn't exist without our seafood industry, whether that be oysters or crawfish or crabs or shrimp or whatever else you can find in our muddy Mississippi waters. But on the other side of that conversation is our water quality. And water quality here is a complicated one. And well, I guess you would argue some people wouldn't say it's complicated at all. It's pretty straightforward, is that it's riddled with oil, petrochemicals, all types of chemical plants. And historically in Louisiana, former plantation lands that were occupied by cotton, sugar, indigo, and swan after Reconstruction, that land was sold off to oil and gas for processing and chemical plants. And now in an area known as Cancer Alley, this area now has a concentration of over 150 chemical plants that are in the same place plantations were and continue to pollute communities that have a historical relationship to that land. Their family members, their ancestors were enslaved on that land, and now they're dying from the same land from petrochemicals. And for those who are not familiar with Cancer Alley, I highly recommend you Google it or YouTube it or whatever, because it is a very enlightening and violent situation happening here in Southeast Louisiana. On the other, and to continue the compounding relationship around water quality, we don't have access to our water. Growing up here in Louisiana, the entire Mississippi River is walled off after the flood of 1927. Levees riddle both sides. So most people here, especially in New Orleans, had never even seen the Mississippi River. There are people today who are my age, 32. There are people older than me. There are people younger than me who have never seen the river in real life. If they're the only way to see it, to be frank, is if you're crossing one of the many bridges in Louisiana. And the thing is the first time I ever put my feet into the Mississippi River was when I was in Minnesota. I had never been in the river. I don't know what that was like. I didn't know what that was like. And, but would I dare to put my feet in the river in Louisiana? Absolutely not. The dead zone is a real thing. It lacks oxygen because of runoff from all of the rivers of America, whether that be from farm runoff or oil and gas or just your regular nastiness that comes from just living with humans. That all comes to Louisiana, and we drink that water here in New Orleans, and most of the cities in Southeast Louisiana drink water. So the relationship to water quality is a complicated one where we can't even see the river to improve the water quality. We don't have a say or a voice in what comes down the Mississippi River. We can't tell Iowa or Minnesota or the Ohio Valley not to pollute their waters. We don't have a say in that. And then additionally, the land that once oppressed many people and was violent and created ongoing trauma and collective trauma still does the same today. And so my organization works with multiple federal coalitions as well as local coalitions to try to solve that problem. And the Clean Water Act is, for us in Louisiana specifically, is not enough. There needs to be more work around environmental justice because the water quality is questionable. And that's one of the things that we're doing right now is many communities in Louisiana can't drink their water smells, their water is yellow. Most people have to boil their water. Most locals would not even dare drink their water. Even in New Orleans, where the water quality is good, most people know historically the water quality has not always been that way. And so with green infrastructure and living with water, we in Louisiana have to deal with the compounding realities that water is a part of our cultural fabric and our traditions, but also is a source of ongoing trauma, as well as health discrepancies, whether that be cancers, diseases, even childbirth mortality rates are all high in Louisiana because of this complicated relationship.
Well, you know, I obviously changing that situation has a lot to do with connecting people to the water, and as you all point out that, you know, many people in cities don't feel connected to their urban watersheds. And you know, especially Jessica, as you point out, you know, when rivers are culverted or hidden behind levees, so you know, or when our shorelines are inaccessible. So how do you all think about connecting people to their waterways, and what are the benefits of water literacy?
I guess I'd start and just say that in Philadelphia, we were surrounded by water. We have 2 rivers going through us, but I think that many people in Philadelphia have said again and again they haven't seen the rivers. They don't go to the rivers. They don't use the rivers. They don't think about their connection to rivers. And I think that when you're working or when you're living in, and you are a person who is facing the tremendous, I think for some people, including myself, unimaginable constraints of poverty, it's kind of hard to prioritize water literacy. But you can prioritize the need to get outside and see your neighbors. You can prioritize the need to take your kids outside and take them to a park. You can prioritize the need to go get some shade on a hot day. I think that for many people, the best way to get connected to water is not to start with water, but to start with something else that has a connection to water. And for people to learn through other channels how their public spaces, for example, are serving not only their need for fresh air, for space that's safe for their kids to play, but are also basically functioning as a liver for their city and filtering out the water that comes into it. And it's those accidental learning opportunities that I think for some people are best designed and most appreciated because they see them, they feel them, they understand them. I don't know that we can, for everybody, I'm not saying that it shouldn't be done on many fronts, but I don't know that for everybody, an intentional prioritization of water literacy in a formal way is really the best avenue for gaining greater understanding, greater appreciation, and greater passion for the need for water quality. We need to be doing that, but we also need to understand that the tremendous constraints that people have and their need to prioritize so many critical first-tier problems. And how do we introduce something that might otherwise feel like just simply not enough hours in the day to attend to?
Jessica and Pete, do you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I think I mean, you could New York City has over 500 miles of coastline, so it's a waterfront city, and the access is organized by affluence throughout the city. So you can see that the best waterfront parks are in the most affluent neighborhoods, and then as you sort of go through the city, you have less and less access. A great example of that is the Harlem River, which separates Manhattan from the Bronx, and most of the Manhattan side of the Harlem River is a park. Most of the Bronx side of the Harlem River is a train track. So there's actually no places to access the water in the entire Bronx side of the Harlem River. And you see that manifest itself in all these interesting ways. So a great example is SUNY Maritime is a public college located in the Bronx. They have 100% job placement for graduates and the highest starting salary of any four-year school in the country. And almost all the students at SUNY Maritime are white. Almost all the students come from Long Island or upstate New York to go to school in the Bronx. And that shows, that's an example of the profound disconnect between young people growing up in New York City, going through the public school system, and like very real good careers that exist in New York City on the water. The Port of New York employs 400,000 people, and somewhere between 10 and 15% of them went to public schools in New York City. So when we think about access to the water as just like one small step in building awareness and affinity, both for the natural world, but also for all these future career opportunities. What does it take a young person, a middle school student, to identify as a future scientist or identify as a future marine engineer? And one critical step to that is just awareness, access, and the ability to access the natural world close to where you live. And we can do that just by, that's what we use our oysters for, is to create an incentive to bring communities down to the water's edge and start improving nature where they live. And I think, sorry, one last thing, I think it's definitely both formal education and these sort of other activities that happen at the water, like oyster restoration. But if you go to public school in Maryland, you learn about the Chesapeake Bay is required for all public school students. There's no similar requirement in New York City to learn about the harbor. So many young people will go through their entire high school career without learning the first thing about New York Harbor. And so I think that there can be some formal education interventions that can also be really important.
So one of the things that we at the Water Club are really focused on is education. And we call it public education because we don't do a certification program or any type of college track or anything like that. But we really try to help residents understand the relationship Louisiana has with water, the agencies that control water, and how you can participate and have some type of self-determination in how water is managed. One of the biggest challenges in Louisiana is that we do not have access to the water, as I mentioned, for a variety of reasons, whether that be port. We have one of the largest and busiest ports in the world, so there's no access to that. And then there's the levee systems. And then again, as I mentioned, nobody wants to put their feet in the water anyway. So the reality is that we have to create green space in New Orleans, and that's what green infrastructure is doing for us. So it's kind of going back around, is that many of the organizations that are working here in Southeast Louisiana are doing it by educating folks, even if they're not participating in the building or implementation or construction. Like I mentioned, Healthy Community Service, Waterways, Groundworks, New Orleans, Limitless Vistas. The list goes on of organizations that are doing their part to educate communities, families, youth about green infrastructure, water management, water quality. Additionally, there are organizations working on trying to create a curriculum around water. Particularly, I'll shout out Ripple Effect, who is a wonderful organization doing education work in school. We're actually talking right now about how to make that mandated in Louisiana. As I mentioned, and I think Allison quoted me on that, is that we have to learn about all of the French people who came here who died 300 years ago, but we don't know about our water systems. We don't know what a watershed is. I didn't learn about this work until I got my master's degree, and I'm from here, and I have generations of families here. So that just shows I'm just a microcosm of a longer, much more a systemic issue here in Louisiana. And the last thing I'll say on education, so we can open the Q&A, is that education here, Louisiana ranks 50th in education, and so we have a massive issue in investment in education. But once we invest in our land, people will be more excited about education. They'll be more, environmental education. So that's one of the things that we're also trying to work on. It's just general investment in our land as well as our education in Louisiana.
Thank you all for your really thoughtful answers. I'll turn it over to Bill for Q&A.
Thank you. We don't have a whole lot of time left for Q&A, but I want to thank our speakers and panelists for a very interesting exchange. A few questions have come up. I will try to go through them quickly, although I'm not sure. We'll probably run over a few minutes if folks are able to do that. But one of the early questions was, given the brief time we have to limit greenhouse gas accumulation, is there a study to identify practices that will most quickly scale to reduce emissions and amplify capture and storage? And that is somewhat connected to a later comment about technology assessments to identify the best choices for various climate solutions. So I'll throw that out on the table if folks have any comments on that.
Well, I will say that in Louisiana, there's a whole big energy around carbon capture and carbon sequestration. I would push our attendees to move away from that, and let's just not be allowing carbon to be in our environment to begin with. The same communities that I mentioned in Cancer Alley are now being poised to be carbon capture areas that are producing more violence and more degradation of the land and actually causing more death. The people who are pushing carbon sequestration in Louisiana are oil and gas. The same people who are creating carbon are trying to sequester it and create more opportunities to make more money off of the backs of people in Louisiana. So I would really push our participants to understand that carbon sequestration is potentially a part of the larger carbon conversation, but it is not the solution nor the answer. The answer is investing in people. The answer is investing in renewables. The answer is investing in nonviolent ways that harm communities further. Louisiana will not exist if we keep producing carbon and depending on carbon sequestration or carbon capture. Louisiana residents will be at the whim of carbon sequestration, just like we're at the whim of oil and gas. So I just want to put that out there, that that's a constant conversation we're having. Meanwhile, people are dying, people are losing their land, and people are losing their assets and living through hurricanes on an ongoing basis. So let's move away from that and let's talk about renewables and other forms of energy.
Well said. Thank you. Other comments on that? All right, I'm just going to switch the topic a little bit. Someone asked about daylighting creeks in terms of restoring urban environments. I know that Philadelphia has a little bit of experience in daylighting. I know I've worked out in Detroit where they've talked about daylighting some creeks. There's also some experience proposed upcoming in New York City, up in the Bronx, I believe, for proposed daylighting. I wondered if anyone had any comments on what place that may have in restoring the urban hydrologic environment.
It's not work that we at the Trust Public Land have gotten very involved in, but I do think when it comes to the concept of transforming space so that it serves the people that are connected to that space, it's very interesting and powerful option. I think that in all cases, this needs to be done with very strong engagement from the folks who are surrounding that area and who need to both understand why it's happening, what it means for them, and also have an opportunity to talk about do they want that? I mean, I'm not saying that everyone gets a say in what their neighborhood looks like, and particularly when it comes to major environmental investments, but I do think that like we do need to be very mindful about how we undertake tremendous infrastructure investments, and I consider daylighting to be one of those. And I think it's very important that one of the first questions just be, what do you think about that? And I think that as we think about how we make the most efficient use of our public dollars, is daylighting the way to do that? And if it is, what other sources can be brought to that table? Because when you're daylighting a stream, you're really creating a new space. And when you are creating new space, that doesn't happen very often. So be sure that you're bringing the correct kind and the right braiding of different funding sources to make the most of that, so that those very considerable resources yield the best impact that they can.
Other comments? Yeah, I will just add that I know in my experience with some cities, there was a desire to daylight what were combined sewers, and that represents kind of a health hazard. And so you need to be very careful about daylighting and what kind of water is carried in the daylighted waterway in the future. But it does create a new opportunity for folks to intersect with the water environment, as you say, creating new access. So
I could say, Bella, I can add one thing
Yeah.
too, that in the Bay Area, there's been some really interesting examples of nature-based adaptation solutions along the shoreline. And one of the experiments that's happening here is the horizontal levee, where we're actually looking at the outfall of sewage treatment plants as being a freshwater source for nourishing wetlands. So it's an interesting switch of thinking about, well, what are the function of creeks or streams, and how do we revive them and think about them as in this new kind of idea of how we handle our shorelines and buffer storm surge. So just one, Jeremy Lowe from San Francisco Estuary Institute was one of the chief scientists behind that work.
yes, California has been especially progressive with respect to reuse and adaptive uses of wastewater and creating it as a freshwater and safe environment. So I read about the wetlands, and that's a great example. Any other final comments? We're at 2 o'clock. I want to close this up just to respect our viewership. Any final parting words? No?
Maybe I could just say that to the audience that the folks here today on this panel are, some incredible folks leading these efforts in their cities. And as I try and cover in the book, there are so many more examples even across this country of people doing this work. And I highly encourage you to find out about them and to find out how people are working in communities, because the work is so inspiring. Often climate change can be daunting and we can get overwhelmed. And I found in looking through this that there's a lot of hopeful examples of what people are doing and how they're looking squarely in the eye of what we face in this country in terms of our very troubled history, but also finding extraordinary solutions and having communities lead that charge. So I'm very inspired by all of you, and thank you so much for being a part of today.
Yes, thank you. Again, remember the Water and Planning Network is a great focus area for exchange of ideas and for learning more about many of these topics. We have about 500 members, and we collaborate not only with the APA, but also American Water Resources Association and AWWA and their Sustainable Water Group and Source Water Collaborative. So we're trying to build those connections. So thank you all for joining today. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.